Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this Meet the Expert talk. I'm Suzanne Higgott, the curator of glass, Limoges painted enamels, earthenware and early furniture at the Wallace collection, and I'm really delighted to be in conversation for today's talk with Dr. Julia Poole. Julia is currently Honorary Keeper of Western Ceramics at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, where she was employed from 1979 and where she was Keeper of Applied Art from 2004 to 2009. Her catalogue of Italian maiolica and incised slipware at the Fitzwilliam Museum was published in 1995. Since her retirement, Julia has been researching the museum's collection of Limoges Renaissance and later painted enamels. Julia and I are going to discuss some painted enamel plates that were originally part of sets that were made in Limoges in south-central France around 1585 to 1600. The sets illustrated scenes from the story of Joseph in the biblical book of Genesis, the first book of the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, as it's more widely known. None of the Joseph plate sets survive intact today. A few years ago, while Julia and I were working on the catalogues of our respective museums' Limoges painted enamels, we joined forces to explore various aspects of the Joseph plates, since the Wallace collection has 2 examples and the Fitzwilliam Museum 3. In 2014, we published an article on the plates, and since then, Julia has given further thought to the French political and religious context in which the plates were produced. I'm going to start by providing some general information about the Joseph plates and some facets of the interest of the story for people in or from the medieval and Renaissance periods. I'll then ask Julia to discuss various aspects of the sets of plates and their likely significance in the later 16th and early 17th centuries. Here you see the 2 Joseph plates in the Wallace collection. Acquired together by Sir Richard Wallace, one of the founders of the collection, they're probably from the same set. They depict Joseph taken to prison on the left and Joseph storing grain on the right. They're typical of the majority of the 35 known extant polychrome Joseph set plates in having a polychrome front, each depicting an episode from the story. They have variously coloured shimmering areas of translucent enamel over foil known as paillon. Their backs in grisaille, a monochrome palette, are decorated with strapwork patterns. The plates are enriched with gilding, front and back, and both plates in the Wallace collection have some damage and repair at their centres. The diameters of the known Joseph plates vary between 19 centimetres and 22.2 centimetres. They're formed from copper, to which the enamels, made from a glassy material coloured with metallic oxides, were fired in a multi-layer technique, the gilding being applied for the final firing. The story of Joseph is a lengthy narrative, almost a novella, and completes the book of Genesis. It was written and set in the ancient Middle East. The story moves between Canaan, the pre-Israelite land of Israel, and Egypt. It's through the story of Joseph that the reader is taken from the last of the 3 Israelite patriarchs, Joseph's father Jacob, to Joseph's death, aged 110, his embalming and placing in a coffin in Egypt, which completes the book of Genesis. Joseph, Jacob's favourite child, incurs the resentment of his older half-brothers. They plot his death, but instead sell him into slavery. Joseph's success in interpreting dreams, his integrity and hard work culminate in his appointment to high office under Pharaoh in Egypt. This leads to his averting famine, his reconciliation with his brothers, his reunion with his father, who had thought him dead, and the resettlement of the family in Egypt. The episodic nature of the narrative lends itself to the production of serial items, making it an appealing subject for a set. These are the 3 Joseph plates in the Fitzwilliam Museum. In narrative, though not consecutive order, they illustrate from left to right here the triumph of Joseph, Joseph's brothers finding money in their sacks, and the reconciliation of Joseph and his brothers. All three came to the museum from the Louis C.G. Clark bequest, but none are thought to be from the same set. The Joseph story has had enduring appeal for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and has inspired works in a range of media over the centuries. Thomas Mann's novel, Joseph and His Brothers, published in 1933, is based on the biblical narrative. In his preface, Mann summarised the essence of the story's appeal, writing that it tells, quote, of the primitive occurrences of human life, of love and hate, blessing and curse, fraternal strife and paternal grief, pride and penance, fall and rise. In our own time, Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice's 1968 musical, Joseph, continues to be revived regularly. Before looking in detail at the Joseph plates, we'll look at some aspects of the story that were of wide interest to people in the medieval and Renaissance periods and later. From a religious perspective, already by the medieval period, Joseph was seen as a paradigm for Christ. Both suffered to redeem mankind. Joseph suffered at the hands of his half-brothers, but told them that his suffering had been ordained in order that he could save lives during the famine. Joseph's sale into slavery was seen as prefiguring Christ's betrayal by Judas for monetary gain. Joseph's sale into slavery and Christ's betrayal by Judas are depicted together on this folio sheet from a Biblia Pauperum or Pauper's Bible, a picture Bible of around 1405. On the left and right, it shows Joseph being sold into slavery, and in the centre, Judas is being paid for his betrayal of Christ. Like Christ, Joseph was seen as a virtuous and innocent victim. Murillo's depiction of Joseph being lowered into the well of around 1665 to 70 in the Wallace collection exemplifies this interpretation. Joseph, robed in white, the colour of innocence, his body language expressive of deep distress, is being lowered into the well by his half-brothers. The subject of dreams and their interpretation was of much interest during the Renaissance, as exemplified early in the 16th century in the series of illustrations of the Joseph story painted by Raphael in his workshop in a Vatican loggia in 1518 to 19. In these scenes from the loggia frescoes, the dreams are represented in bubbles. In the scene on the left, Joseph stands in the centre, recounting to his half-brothers his dreams. In the bubble, top left, of the sun, moon, and stars, is understood to represent his family, bowing down to him. And in the bubble on the right of the left-hand image, his brother's sheaves, bowing down to his sheaf. And in the scene on the right, Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams of 7 fat ears of corn being devoured by 7 thin ears in that third bubble along, so the one on the left in the second image. And in the other bubble on the right, the 7 fat cattle being devoured by 7 thin cattle, as presaging 7 plentiful agricultural years for Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. But our focus today is on the sets of painted enamel plates illustrating the Joseph story, made in Limoges around 1585 to 1600. At the time, Limoges was renowned for its painted enamels, which had reached the apogee of success with French court patronage in the 1540s and 1550s. Thematic sets of plates were already an established part of Limoges painted enamel production by the late 16th century. For example, sets of calendar plates illustrating the months of the year were produced by several workshops, and this is a rare example of a complete surviving set of calendar plates. The Joseph plates were a speciality of a prolific multi-generational workshop that used as its maker's mark the letters IC. And you can see on several plates here, several Limoges enamels, the workshop's mark, with slight variations, but always the IC. The letters are understood to stand for Jean Court, and the plates to have been made in the Court family workshop. At the period when the plates were made, archival records in Limoges indicate that there were probably 3 enamelers named Jean Court in Limoges, a father and son, and another who was probably related to them. It's not possible to know how, within the family workshop, the production of the sets of plates was divided. The Joseph plates rims, and you see the one in the Wallace collection on the right, the Joseph plates rims are closely comparable with those of a set of plates illustrating the life of the Virgin by the same workshop that have the de Vic coat of arms at the centres of their lower borders. And you see an example on the left, and there is the coat of arms. And this example is from the Grünes Gewölbe or Green Vault in Dresden. Now, the de Vic plates can be dated between about 1588 and 1602. And the arms were modified in 1603. So this is helpful for us, given the similarity of the borders in dating the Joseph plates. Here you see examples of 4 plates illustrating the scene Joseph storing grain from the sets of Joseph plates. Given the number of episodes from the Joseph story depicted on the plates overall, and the number of repeats of individual scenes on the extant known examples, it seems certain that there were 12 plates in a set, and very likely that there were at least 4 polychrome sets with mulberry backgrounds appearing black, 1 polychrome set with a blue background, and 1 set in grisaille, a monochrome palette. Each set would have depicted the same 12 episodes from the story. Julia, could you talk a little bit about how we can distinguish between the sets?
Yes, it seems probable that the sets had already been broken up by the end of the 18th century, and this makes it very difficult to trace their history back and batch them up into groups. There are 4 main ways of doing this. First of all, by looking at the 2 largest groups of plates surviving together, which coincidentally are also the groups which appear to have been together longest and are most similar in appearance. The most secure of these 6 plates, depicting the first 6 scenes in the series, had belonged to the Duc de Brissac, and during the French Revolution was seized by the revolutionary government in 1793 and transferred to the Louvre in 1794. They might have been 6 plates which were mentioned in the inventory taken in 1696 after the decease of a famous collector, Everard Jarbach. A second way is by looking at the colour of the ground. A small number have a blue ground like those on the screen now, and we found 9 altogether, and the rest have the usual black ground, actually a very dark mulberry colour. The largest group of 7 plates appear to have been together since about 1862, when they were exhibited in London, when they were in the collection of Lionel de Rothschild. They depict different scenes, including the 11th, which indicates that they would have been part of a set of 12. And judging by these 2 large groups, I think we can be fairly certain that they either had a blue ground or a black ground and were not mixed. A third way is by looking at the overall colour range. The enamel colours used on the plates was the same for all of them: blue, green, yellow, turquoise blue, mulberry, red, black, and white. But when we look at some plates, there seems to be more emphasis on one colour than another. So some of them seem a bit more blue and green, and others there's a little bit more red. Now, red was a rather difficult colour to obtain, and gold foil was used below it instead of silver. So it was used less. And if we look at this set of plates from the Rothschild collection, you can see that red does seem to be a little bit more prominent, particularly in the one that's in the middle. but it could be that the lighting under which this photography was done has brought out the red colours more. And so I wouldn't really like to judge on that point without the plates to hand. And fourthly, we can look at very small details in the plates, like where the artist did the figures and the border patterns, and try and match them up in that way. On the Louvre's pieces, all 6 have the same pattern on the side of the well, whereas on this group here, some of them have scrolling foliage or arabesques, and the other has the other border of overlapping slanting S's. So we can't be sure that the sets had matching designs on the side of the wells. And in fact, it could be that these plates come from 2 sets.
Thank you. There may have been one set in grisaille, a monochrome palette, and here you see an example. We know of 2 Joseph plates in grisaille, Joseph and Potiphar's wife, which you see on the screen, which is in the Taft Museum in Cincinnati, and Benjamin being presented to Joseph by his brothers, which appeared in a Christie's sale in 1983. The 2 subjects are well spaced out in the story, so this kind of supports evidence of a set, as the second subject wouldn't have stood well on its own. Julia, do you think that the low number of grisaille Joseph plates reflects the change in taste back to polychrome enamels from grisaille enamels in the last quarter of the 16th century?
Yes, I think it does. The similarity of the back of the grisaille plate in the Taft Museum to the one which occurs most frequently on the back of the polychrome plates does seem to indicate that they were made fairly close together in date. And if that's true, one of the most likely reasons for grisaille plates being rare is that grisaille was going out of fashion by about 1580, having enjoyed a very long period of popularity in the middle of the century. And therefore, it's likely that more of the plates would have been made in the latest fashion, with silver and gold foils under translucent enamels. Another reason I think might be that there was a taste for polychrome ceramics coming in too, with imported Italian maiolica, and also the foundation of a maiolica workshop in Lyon in 1581. And this would eventually lead to enamel tailored work almost completely going out of fashion by the 1630s. Another possibility is that the grisaille plates may actually have been used more, and this led to their deterioration and destruction because enamel doesn't stand up very well to being washed. Whereas the more glamorous polychrome plates may have been displayed more frequently than used, and they may have been preserved and eventually become collector's items.
So here we're seeing 3 different Joseph plates showing the same subject, the triumph of Joseph. Julia, do you think individual hands can be distinguished amongst the plates? I mean, do you think that it's possible that people specialised in painting specific scenes in the series?
Distinguishing hands is a very difficult subject because I think scholars have quite subjective vision. My view is that there's a tendency to find more hands than there actually were. It is possible, definitely, to distinguish the hands of enamelers such as Pierre Raymond, Léonard Limousin, or Jean-Claude de Vigier, just as it is with other artists. But when considering whether there were more than one enameler in one workshop, one has to consider whether the differences are those of different executants or the result of one man maturing, becoming more or less competent, or just being less careful with unimportant commissions. And one has to look at the small details on the plates and also at the overall impression. And there are also differences between the grisaille technique, which results in a rather painterly effect, and the polychrome over paillance technique, in which the surface is broken up into small areas over the foils and may therefore look rather different in style. Now, although the 3 plates on the screen now look fairly alike, except perhaps for the center one, there are some quite noticeable differences between them. For example, on the one on the left, the overall effect is rather neat and tidy, and the profiles of the faces have very Grecian straight noses. The draperies are not very detailed. The hands look a little bit perfunctory, and they have what I describe as tennis ball knees. If you look in the middle plate, the noses are really quite retroussé in style, and the legs are painted in a quite different manner from the other one. And there's a considerably more detail on the right side in the way that the draperies are painted. And you can also see a difference in the masks on the side. The ones on the left are very neatly executed and are very good. But if you look at the ones in the center plate, they appear to have a great deal more depth and expression to them. And the one on the right is actually more like the plate on the left from a stylistic point of view. And this does suggest to me that the one in the middle might be by a different hand.
Yeah. And I suppose that on the two plates in the Wallace collection, the style and colouring seem more alike.
Yes, I think they do. I think you get the feeling that they probably are the same person, I think.
Yes, yes. And do you think there could have been a division of labour between the decoration of the central scenes, the borders and the backs of the Joseph plates?
Well, I think the straight answer to this is that we really don't know. There's very little evidence at all for what enamelling workshops were like in 16th century France, partly because the enamelers never had their own guild. And so we don't have documentary records like apprenticeship records or when somebody got their mastership. But I don't think we should envisage workshops with a division of labour in the decoration, such as we find in ceramic factories like Sèvres or Wedgwood in the 18th century. But it does seem possible from a practical point of view that the grisaille backs of the plates could have been done by one person and the polychrome fronts by another. There are little holes on the back around the rim where they were propped up to prevent the backs touching the bottom of the kiln. And but on the other hand, I think when looking at the fronts, because the colours had to be fired at different temperatures, it seems to me more likely that one person would have been responsible for doing both the borders and the centre, but we can't be absolutely certain. What we know of enamel workshops is known from evidence from the 17th century, and it seems that they were family businesses with the enamelling taking place on one of the upper floors of the house, some of which were quite large. And when the enamelling industry was at its height, however, in the 16th century, enormous quantities of enamels were being produced. And so it's highly likely that there were assistants in the workshops. These are very likely to be sons or perhaps a nephew, but also people outside, someone outside the factory. And these people might have been working, for example, in cleaning the copper before it was enameled, because it had to be very clean, possibly grinding and purifying the colours and fetching the fuel for the kiln, or perhaps enamelling small items such as hat badges or small religious plaques. And we can see that some pieces initialed IC for Jean Cour or PR for Pierre Raymond are not all by the same hand. But that doesn't imply that there was necessarily collaboration between the people working in the workshop.
Thank you. Well, there are, we can see that there are, the borders were not consistent within each set. And we've identified 9 different border designs being used on the Joseph plates, and you see the 9 in this slide. You'll see that they look very similar because they all have a mask at 12, 3, and 6 and 9 o'clock with an ornamental motif repeated between each pair of masks. And judging by the extant examples of the plates, the border pattern in number 1, which you see at the top left, was the most frequently used. And there are 10 examples of that border pattern, which you see here on an example from the Walters Museum in Baltimore of the subject being Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. The back designs within the Joseph plate sets were also not consistent, and 11 different back designs have been identified on the Joseph plates. Judging by the extant examples that we know of, design number 1, which you see in the top left here, was the most widely used, and we know of 9 examples of that on the Joseph plates. So here you see a back view of Joseph taken to prison in the Wallace collection, and that's design, what Julia and I have identified as design number 1 of the back designs, so the one that occurs most frequently. All the Joseph plates known to us are modelled on prints. From around 1530, the Old Testament reached a wider audience through the publication of illustrated Bibles. This Italian earthenware or maiolica plate in the Wallace collection on the left, showing Joseph being lowered into the pit, represented here as a well by his brothers, is after a woodcut by Sebald Beham in the Biblische Historien, published in Frankfurt in 1533. And you see an example from the Warburg Institute of that print on the right. Julia, could you tell us something about the new religious factors that led to the Old Testament stories becoming better known after the 1520s?
I think one of the most important reasons was the Reformation movement, because the Protestant reformers, such as Luther in Germany and Calvin in France and Switzerland, recommended the study of the Old Testament as a means of teaching moral and religious precepts. And they promoted the publication of vernacular Bibles, which very gradually brought the Old Testament to a growing literate audience, despite considerable opposition to lay Bible reading, for example, by the Sorbonne in France. And the Huguenots, that is the French Protestants, often identified themselves with the persecuted Israelites. But Bibles would have been costly, and therefore their readership was fairly limited still. And it was the publication of more popular picture Bibles, which Suzanne has just mentioned, such as Historiarum Veteris Testament Iconis, images of the Old Testament, with illustrations by Holbein, published in Lyon, 1539, which were bringing the stories in a more lively way to the general public. The Old Testament could also be read legitimately in a retelling by the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, in which the extensive story of Joseph occurs in Book 2. Originally in Greek, this work was widely read in France in Latin in the late 15th and 16th centuries, and after 1530, there were numerous printed editions of it in Latin and French. Another attractive aspect of the Old Testament stories for enamelers and other craftsmen was that they often involved very large groups of people in dramatic action. For example, the destruction of Pharaoh's host while crossing the Red Sea. And these were ideal for filling large spaces on dishes and basins.
Here we see the first scene in the sequence of scenes shown on the Joseph plate, Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Julia, could you tell us something about the impact of the publication by Jean de Tourne in Lyon in 1553 of Claude Paradin's Quadrant historique de la Bible, of which we see an illustration on the right, which was clearly the source, the likely source for the plate showing the scene of Joseph and Potiphar's wife?
Yes, the problem with the earlier picture Bibles, which we've mentioned, was that they only had 1 or 2 woodcut illustrations for each story, and so they couldn't be used for a whole series of objects, such as tapestries or plates. But the publication by Jean de Tourne in Lyon in 1553 of Claude Paradin's Quadrant historique de la Bible was an absolute boon for artisans, because it included significantly more illustrations on which they could draw for a series of narrative scenes. The illustrations were by Bernard Salomon and included 26 for the Joseph story, which were increased to 36 in the second edition, which was published in 1555. And further editions were published in 1558 and 1583. It was extraordinarily influential, and its woodcuts were copied by many different craftsmen in different European countries because it was translated, for example, into English and Italian. And like these earlier picture Bibles, Quadra Historique was in emblem book format. That is, it had a picture with a little verse underneath which identified the subject. And this means that we can be absolutely certain what every subject was on the Limoges plates. But the same 12 plates actually appeared in one of the French editions of Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, which was published in Lyon in 1562. And it's therefore possible that a wealthy and educated patron who'd read that book might, in fact, have seen the Joseph scenes then and have commissioned a set of plates to match. But I think it's probably more likely that the enamelers used Quadra Historique Labib. After its publication, the Joseph story was depicted on a wide range of objects in Limoges painted enamels by several different workshops. Jean Cordy Vigier's first documented use of the book was in 1555 on a casket decorated with scenes from the story, which is now in the British Museum. And the figures on this are actually very close to those on the Joseph plates. 9 of the scenes on the Joseph plates follow the woodcuts in Quadra Historique de la Bible.
The scenes illustrated on the plates only extend from Joseph's rejection of the enticements of Potiphar's wife, which we see here, to his reconciliation with his brothers. The plates copied the prints in putting the biblical reference above the image in gold. So if you look at the print on the right, you'll see it gives us the source, the Genesis source, Genesis chapter 39 above the image. And then if you look closely at the plate on the left, you can see in gold, G for Genesis, above the bed canopy, and just to the right of it, G for Genesis, and then the Roman numerals for 39. So there's a sort of imitative thing going on there between the print source and the decoration of the plate. Julia, can you talk about, say something about the choice of prints, what the choice of prints for the plates might indicate, what might suggest, how it might suggest that they had a first edition of the book, the 1553 edition?
Yes, well, we know, as I've just said, that they must have had a copy of the book by 1555, the date of the second edition. But in the set of Joseph plates, a really interesting feature of it that they omitted one of the most crucial scenes, which was the discovery of the cup in Benjamin's sack. And this may indicate that they had a copy of the first edition in 1553, because in that edition, that scene from the story isn't illustrated, and it only appears in the later editions of the book. Although it seems likely that they would have obtained a later edition in order to have access to all the available subjects.
Yeah, and could you tell us something about additions that the enamelers made to the plates, or using this as an example, to adding features that aren't actually in the print source?
Yes, you may have noticed this already in some of the plates shown, is that one of the interesting quirks of this workshop is that they inserted hounds or other dogs into scenes in which they were not present in the original print or woodcut that was being copied. And in this one, you can see that there's a white hound below Joseph and a gold cat underneath Potiphar's wife. And these are put in to indicate Joseph's faithfulness to his master Potiphar in resisting his wife's lascivious and adulterous behavior. And the cat is indicating that because cats were regarded as promiscuous and shifty creatures. And several of the other plates in the series have additional hounds. They also put in tiled floors. In this particular print, there is a tiled floor, but in some of the other ones, there isn't any floor whatsoever. And they put in a tiled floor with alternately patterned tiles like the ones you can see on the plate on the left.
So we've reached the point now where the next few slides show the scenes depicted on the Joseph plates in chronological order, starting with this one, depicting Joseph escaping the lustful attentions of his first master, Potiphar's wife. Joseph's cloak is blue here, and it's shown in blue being held by Potiphar's wife in the next scene. So you can see she's grabbing it as he tries to make his escape. And here, the next scene, the second scene of the 12 used for the Joseph plates, is Joseph being taken to prison. And if you look at the right-hand side of the central scene, you can see Potiphar's wife holding Joseph's blue coat. Julia, could you say something, please, about the stylistic qualities of the depictions of the scenes in the Quadrant Historique and why they might have had particular appeal for the enamelers and their patrons?
Well, the early woodcuts, like the one we saw by Bairn, show the story of Joseph in North European dress, with perhaps a turban to indicate a Middle Eastern character. And hence, by the later part of the century, they'd become dated. And the attraction of Bernard Salomon's illustrations, what the figures have a sort of, look at them closely, you'll see they have a kind of timeless, vaguely antique or Middle Eastern costume, and we're in the elegant Mannerist style introduced from Italy, artist working at the Chateau of Fontainebleau in the 1530s and 1540s. The elongated legs, for example, and the rather willowy bodies are absolutely typical of that style. Salomon didn't attempt to create an ancient Egyptian background, you'll notice, for the Joseph scenes, but he used pseudo-classical architecture such as rotunda and basilicas and arcades as a background. And it was increasing interest in the classical world in France in the 16th century.
Thank you. And here are the next two scenes from the sets of Joseph plates. So in prison, Joseph correctly interprets the dreams of two of Pharaoh's servants, and he's eventually recommended to Pharaoh himself as an interpreter of dreams. And here on the left, we see Pharaoh dreaming the dream of the 7 thin cows devouring the 7 fat cows. And then on the right, we see Joseph, having been released from prison, interpreting Pharaoh's dreams and explaining them as anticipating 7 rich agricultural years, followed by 7 years of famine. And here we see the 5th scene in the series on the left, Joseph being paraded in triumph in Egypt, and him overseeing on the right the storage of grain, because on the left-hand scene, of course, he's been appointed to great power, second only to Pharaoh in Egypt, to being put in charge of storing and allocating grain. So he's actually being paraded in Pharaoh's second best chariot. And on the right, he has the spade in the foreground, he's supervising the storage of grain, and he's pausing to speak to Pharaoh. Can you tell us something, Julia, about what resonances this scene might have had for an educated, or the scene of the triumph on the left would have had for an educated contemporary audience?
Yes, I think it would probably have reminded an educated late 16th century viewer of either a triumph of Caesar or one of the French royal entries into cities, which become increasingly Roman in character as the century progressed. And Bernard Salomon had participated in preparation for Henry II's entry into Lyon in 1548, and he prepared the woodcut illustrations for a book recording the celebrations, which was published in 1549. And his woodcut of the triumph of Joseph is reminiscent of Roman triumphs inspired by Mantegna's triumph of Caesar, although no complete set of prints after it was known until just before the end of the century. And a more likely source of inspiration was an original series of 12 very large woodcuts, which followed Appian's account of Scipio's entry into Rome by Jacob of Strasbourg, which was published in Venice in 1504. And we know that these had arrived in France very soon after because they appeared in miniature in a book of hours, printed book of hours.
Thank you. And here we see on the left scene 7, the birth of Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to his wife Asenath. And on the right, scene 8, Joseph imprisons his brothers as spies while one kneels before him, pleading their innocence. Julia, could you tell us about the estrich, the other print source for these Joseph plates, the estrich print source, which was used for the scene depicting the birth of Joseph's sons on the left here?
Yes, for some reason that we probably never know, Quadre historique de la Bible was not used as a source for all the plates in the Joseph series. The birth of Joseph's sons is one of 3 scenes in the series, number 7, 10, and part of number 12, which were derived from woodcuts in a comparable but much less influential work, Guillaume Gérard's Figure de la Bible illustrée de Huitaine François, which was published in Lyon by Guillaume Rouet or Roville in 1564. And this was illustrated with woodcuts by Pierre Vase or Escric, which had first appeared in a Bible in 1562. And it's really the most important evidence we have that these plates must have been made after 1562. Still gives them a very wide date range, but at least we can say they couldn't have been made before that date.
Yes, so it's really, really helpful to have that date. And for the right-hand scene, just say a little bit about it. Joseph's family back in Canaan is starving, and his older half-brothers come to see Pharaoh's renowned overseer, unbeknown to them, their brother Joseph, to buy grain. Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. And so in the scene on the right, Joseph imprisons his brothers as spies while they're in Egypt for the purpose of buying food. One of them is kneeling before him, insisting that they are not spies, they're completely innocent. And the story becomes redolent with emotional turmoil. Joseph's recognition of his brothers, his anguish as to whether or not to reveal himself to them or to take revenge on them, and the cruel demands he makes of them before revealing himself to them. And then, of course, ultimately, their reconciliation. And then the 9th scene of the plates shows having left their brother Simeon behind as a hostage with Joseph, Joseph's brothers depart from Egypt laden with sacks of grain, which they purchased for their father Jacob. And you see them back home in Canaan with their sacks and with Jacob, their father. And on the journey back, one of them had discovered that their payment to Joseph had been returned to their sacks. And so they're showing the money to their father Jacob. And then in scene 10 from the plates on the right, Joseph's brothers have returned to Egypt, bringing Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, and his full brother back with them as Joseph had demanded. And Joseph is telling on the left, Joseph is telling his steward to prepare a feast because he's delighted to see his younger brother Benjamin, and he wants to have a feast. And this print is after the Pierre Estrich Figure de la Bible, published in Lyon in 1565. And then here we have the last 2 scenes from the sets of plates. On the left, scene 11, Joseph's servants load the brothers' sacks with provisions and money and hide a silver cup in Benjamin's sack. And then on the right, Joseph, having revealed his identity to his brothers, wept and rejoiced over them and embraced his full brother Benjamin. And Joseph, now reconciled with his brothers, rejoices with them.
So this series of plates therefore ends on an optimistic note. Joseph's reconciliation with his brothers is approved by Pharaoh, who you can see top left with a rug leaning out of a window, who invites them to bring their father Jacob and the family to live with them in Egypt. And it's a scene of reconciliation and forgiveness, human qualities which eluded the Protestants and Catholics so violently at odds with each other in contemporary France.
The final section of the narrative isn't depicted on the known plates. Joseph's reunion with his father Jacob, the family's move to Egypt, where they live well and happily until Jacob's death, and the concluding episode of the book of Genesis, the death of Joseph himself. So Julia, this brings us to the question, at the time when the Joseph plates were made, what was the appeal of the story?
Well, in trying to explain this, I think we have to say that the story could be interpreted in different ways, and we're just going to describe one or two of them. And one of the most likely possibilities that it could have been given a political interpretation. And during the 16th century, it was very common for monarchs to identify themselves with biblical rulers, as they did with Roman emperors and mythological heroes like Mars and Hercules. And one of the most outstanding mid-16th century examples of biblical self-identification was a series of magnificent tapestries, of which you can see one on the left, of scenes from the life of Joseph, which were commissioned by the second Duke of Tuscany, Cosimo de' Medici, and were made between 1546 and 1553. They were designed by Bronzino, Pontormo, and Salviati, and were hung in Florence in the old Palazzo Vecchio. The episodes chosen have very obvious analogies with the expulsion of the Medici by the Florentines in 1527, their triumphant return after the appointment of Cosimo as head of state in 1537, and his regaining support from the Florentines through righteous living and firm government and patronage of the arts. And the commission for these tapestries is thought to have been influenced by a treatise on Joseph by the first century philosopher Philo of Alexandria, which had become known in Florence in the early 15th century. And Philo had interpreted the story of Joseph as the education of the ideal statesman who should be incorruptible, prudent, just, and magnanimous, and therefore able to create order where there was discord. And granted the close diplomatic contacts between Florence and the French court, it's highly likely that this would have been well known there. And the omission of scenes from Joseph's youth on the plates suggests that they were chosen to illustrate the statesmanlike qualities of the mature Joseph. Now, politics and religion were inextricably and horribly linked in the 16th century, and many analogies can be drawn between the story of Joseph and the political scene in France after 1550. For example, there was unusually strong emphasis on forgiveness and reconciliation in the story of Joseph, and the large number of woodcuts devoted to it in Quadrais, Tariq, to Rabib suggests that the story would have seemed particularly apposite when the work was published in the 1550s, and it was still hoped that there could be reconciliation between the opposing religious factions. And this aspect of the story and Joseph's prudent storage of grain to mitigate the effects of the famine in Egypt would have made the story even more apt in the late 50s and 1580s and 1590s, when years of fighting between the Huguenots and Catholics and a series of very bad harvests had reduced the peasants in many areas, including the Limousin, to near starvation. And the situation was exacerbated when Henry IV came to the throne, because he was a Protestant, and even after he abjured the Protestant faith in 1593 and was crowned in 1594, it proved very difficult for him to restore order and obtain the allegiance of the cities held by Roman Catholics. However, once they or individuals had expressed contrition for their opposition to the king, he responded magnanimously to them while stressing his divine right to command their obedience. If the Joseph plates were made after about 1589, it might very well be conjectured that the subject was chosen because Henry IV could have been viewed as a new Joseph who would bring peace and prosperity to France through conciliation of opposing factions. However, Suzanne and I were quite unable to find any references to Henry IV as Joseph. In the descriptions of royal entries into former Catholic League-held cities between 1594 and 1605, for example, the authors almost always allude to the king as Hercules, Mars, Moses, or King David. But this doesn't necessarily preclude him being thought of by some person as a new Joseph. it's possibly more likely that provincial governors or intendants of justice appointed by Henry IV might have identified themselves with Joseph as Pharaoh's viceroy because of their mission to pacify the provinces and prevent conflict between the Huguenots and Roman Catholics. A man like Mary de Vic, who had the Life of the Virgin plates for him, might very well have ordered a set of Joseph plates while he was living in Limoges for about a year.
None of the Joseph plates bear coats of arms, nevertheless, sets might have been considered an appropriate commission to celebrate a marriage because they included scenes connected with chastity, childbirth, and filial affection. And I wondered if you'd like to say something about the possible reasons for them not having coats of arms and also their appropriateness to the celebration of a marriage.
Well, for some strange reason, unlike silver and indeed ceramics like Italian maiolica, coats of arms are actually very unusual on Limoges enamels. There are some for example, the Seguier family and the de Meme family, which have clearly had services with coats of arms, which are now spread about in various European and American museums. So the fact that there aren't arms on these sets doesn't indicate that they weren't intended for noble families. People do always like to say that things are made as wedding gifts, but obviously people did give gifts for wedding and other occasions, and very often in France and in Germany during this period, gifts were in the form of standing cups with a cover on the top. But sets of plates would have been a suitable gift, or they might have been made by a married couple during their marriage and perhaps had their coats of arms put on them. So the Joseph story does have these references to marital chastity in its first scene and to childbirth and brotherly love. And it is possible that some of these plates could perhaps have been made to celebrate a wedding, perhaps to be used at a wedding feast.
Thank you. Well, that's a very upbeat and positive note on which to conclude our talk. So thank you very much indeed, Julia, for agreeing to present the Joseph plates with me. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.